We consider Ilyenkov a key figure in the history of Marxism of 20th century. The history of 20th century was very heavy. The processes which take place in so-called socialist countries put a shade on the very idea of socialism and communism, and Marxist theory, which consider itself to be a scientific theory, transforms into flat ideology. Even the problem of self-identification, the problem of right to name ourselves Marxist, become something very complicated. Before we talk about the development of Marxist thought, it's necessary to define what we usually call Marxism. For today, this term is used quite arbitrarily. Some call themselves Marxist in order to emphasize their progressivism and try on the mantle of left-wing intellectuals. Others try to be taken for their own among self-described left-wing politicians. Finally, others use the word Marxism as a synonym for world evil and generously label all their opponents as Marxists. Here in Russia, we often can hear such a definition for Putin and his gang as Marxists. So much the surprise we hear then the Marxists include the executioner of the October Revolution, Joseph Jugashvili, and his victim, Lev Trotsky, the colorless party bones, Leonid Brezhnev, and the charismatic leader of Chinese Cultural Revolution, Chairman Mao, the butcher, Pol Pot, and the good-hearted Senator Bernie Sanders. Finally, in the conservative press, can we meet even such a political label as a drug Marxists? For us, as well for the hero of our story, Evald Ilyenkov, to call someone a Marxist means to say that this is a man who adheres to a certain system of scientific views, above all the materialistic views. It's to say democrat and humanist, because democracy and humanism are a natural conclusion from the consistent materialism. On the contrary, those who insist that everyone has the right to call themselves a Marxist without knowing or sharing the scientific principles of Marx's teaching bring Marxism down to the level of quasi-religious ideology. However, I strongly believe that the very term Marxism is extremely unfortunate because it disorients underprepared people, putting in the first place not a revolutionary cause, but the name of the theorist of communism. Marx himself was infinitely far from claiming the role of a prophet or founder of a new world religion. Accordingly, He considered his main theoretical work not as tablet of covenant, but as scientific texts, that is, as texts that not only can, but must be criticized and developed. And it is not his fault if, after his death, others began to sculpt a new revolutionary gospel from Karl Marx. Marxism is not a self-name for everyone, but it's synonymous with the science as such. Arbitrary self-identification is not an attribute of science, but of ideology. You can't declare yourself a physicist only because you sympathize with Galileo or Einstein. Meanwhile, in order to proclaim ourselves Marxists for some reason, it's considered sufficient to sympathize with the most vague left ideas. There is no shadow of an elitism in the requirement of knowledge of the scientific foundation of Marxism as a condition of the possibility of Marxist self-identification. This is condition sine qua non of non-ideological, authentic scientific Marxism. What is the scientific type of consciousness? Science, the scientific type of consciousness, is impossible without movement through contradictions. Therefore, science is always the opposite of apologetics, because apologetics hates any contradictions. And here you can see two figures with typical position. The founder of new thinking of Neue Zeit, René Descartes, who left us his brilliant motto, de omnibus dubitur. This is expression of most evident criticism. This is a position for scientists. And the position of Tertullian, old Christian thinker, credo quia absurdum. I believe because the subject of my belief is something absolute. This is principle of ideology, of any ideology. Marx and Engels made the greatest breakthrough in theory, formulating the principles of materialistic dialectic, materialistic active monism, that has laid the foundations of science about man and society. And now my presentation finished, and I will accurately move to my text. After Engels' death, Marxism actually ceased to be a science, for the theoretical heritage of the classics of Marxism was completely denied, subject to reactionary criticism from the right, or apologetically overestimated as a supposedly complete whole, which didn't need development, but only to be supplemented with the latest empirical facts. As a result, in 20th century, there was an obvious regression of Marxism from science to ideology. The so-called Marxism-Leninism, being monopolized by the dominant class of nomenclatura in the USSR, lost all meaningful connection with the revolutionary communist idea and turned into a typical bourgeois ideology serving the interests of the dominant class. Lenin is undoubtedly an outstanding thinker and revolutionary. His work left a deep mark on the history of revolutionary workers' movement. But that's why his theoretical work, first of all, deserves the closest critical analysis. And this analysis forces us to state that it bears part of the blame for the transformation of Marxism from a critical science to an apologetic ideology. And it is not even that he rehabilitated the very term ideology by introducing the oxymoron revolutionary proletarian ideology. That is half the trouble. What is much worse is that Lenin set a bad example by treating the classical theoretical legacy of Karl Marx, and above all his Capital, as a complete text that is not subject to criticism, as something that is devoid of internal contradictions, and therefore doesn't need and is not capable of development. Lenin's book, called Imperialism and the Highest, as the highest stage of capitalism, can be considered as an example of such development. This work, with the apologetic Soviet tradition proclaimed as a new Leninist stage in the development of Marxist political economy, by the definition of Lenin himself, is only a popular essay, a summary of the text of Hilferding, the methodology of which differs from the dialectical method of Capital as heaven from the earth, and in fact is nothing but vulgar empiricism. Materialism and empirical criticism is not a breakthrough in Marxist philosophy, much less the discovery of a new stage in Marxist too. The main drawback of this book is that Lenin conducts the absolutely necessary criticism of positivism, not from the point of view of activity materialism, but from the point of view of sensualism, from the point of the old materialists mentioned by Marx in the thesis on Feuerbach. As a result, his defense of materialism is weak, and he had to replace the missing theoretical arguments with vigorous assurance. This doesn't negate the enormous importance of Lenin's figure for the history of the revolutionary movement and the history of scientific socialism. After the death of Marx and Engels, Lenin was undoubtedly the most significant figure for the revolutionary movement and for Marxist thought. By the scale of thought, it's impossible to put next to him none of his contemporaries. But that's why, as long as we are interested in development of Marxist thought and not in exercising in vulgar apologetics, we shouldn't repeat his mistakes in relation to the text of classics, which can be protected from revision from the right only by moving the thought contained in them forward. That's finding logical contradictions and meaningfully sublating them. The period from the day of Lenin's death to the appearance of Ilyenkov is the period when scientific Marxist thought completely came off the stage, and both in the USSR and in the West was replaced by a flat ideology. Unable to hesitant to give a scientific, political and economic analysis of the nature of social economic relations in the USSR, the left theorists focused their efforts on what they thought was a more obvious task, on purely ideological criticism of consciousness. Thus, idealistic psychology was born and to this day it remains dominant among left-wing ideologies as the substitution of materialistic political economy. To this psychology, we attribute not only the psychology of Freud and his various epigons, but also the so-called cultural historical psychology of Lev Vygotsky. Stalin's death and the thaw that followed gave rise to hope that Marxism will be able to regain the dignity of science, and in the USSR these hopes were associated with a young philosopher and veteran of the Second World War, Evald Ilyenkov. Ilyenkov's first fundamental work, The Dialectics of Abstract and Concrete in Marxist Capital, immediately made Ilyenkov an international celebrity and was an attempt to fulfill Lenin's theoretical proposal to abstract from Marx's main work its logic. And also, already in this book, Ilyenkov proved himself as a serious theorist. Its genre, conceived as a commentary of Capital, strictly didn't go beyond ideology because it didn't involve a meaningful critical analysis of Marxist theoretical heritage. That, however, in the conditions of the USSR was fraught with political persecution and loss of the opportunity to legally engage in science. The monograph Dialectics of Abstract and Concrete in the Capital of Marx, Ilyenkov takes a significant step in overcoming the manner of the scholastic ideological interpretation of the main categories of dialectical materialism of Marx and Engels. But for all significance of this work, for the revival of classical thought, it should be understood that its scientific, not ideological character is conditioned by the fact that the work contains criticism of positivism prevailing in both the USSR and in the West. But this is also the historical limitation of this work. To completely overcome the ideological perversion of Marxism, one requires criticism of Marxism itself, not just its positivist or postmodernist interpreters. Denial of a petty and vulgar idea can yield only a very modest result. At best, it is a repetition and popularization of old discoveries. To get a significant result, you should take on a much more difficult task, the task of detecting and overcoming the contradictions in a really great theory. According to the dialectic of the abstract and concrete, is mainly based on traditional non-active logic, rooted in the old materialistic idea that sensory perception and their verbal design allegedly precede objective activity as such, and moreover, are its necessary prerequisite. Here's how Ilyenkov put it himself: the ability to express one's sensory impressions in speech, in words, in statements, in a combination of utterances. It is, as it is easy to understand, the ability to arise more elementary and earlier than the ability to think, than the ability to reflect reality in concepts. The first is a necessary prerequisite and a condition for the emergence of the second. But the second cannot be reduced to the first. Otherwise, indeed, the greatest thinkers would automatically be the greatest talkers, the greatest specialist of academic blah, 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 would automatically be the greatest thinkers. This is verse of Hegel. Ilyenkov cites it. It should be noted that even in this reasoning, Ilyenkov sharply distances himself from the typical positivist reduction of thinking to speech without voice, to arbitrary semiotics. He insists that thinking cannot be reduced to passive sensation and to the arbitrary designation in verbal signs. But the very feeling, the very ability to feel, something he so far interprets as a condition of the possibility of thinking. Note that this logic is not something special, which is peculiar only to Ilyenkov. This is the logic of all pre-Marxist philosophers, with the exception of Spinoza. Even the great idealist Hegel begins his phenomenology of the spirit with sensual authenticity and perception. We will find a similar idea in Lenin, who in Materialism and Empirical Criticism formulates, matter is something that, acting on our senses, produces a feeling. Matter is an objective reality given to us in our sense, etc. Knowing the later Spinozist texts of Ilyenkov, it's easy to see in this Leninist definition a whimsical mixture of Cartesian reflex and Lockean sensation. However, Ilyenkov himself in this work mentions Spinoza only briefly, as the antithesis of Locke, as a theorist firmly standing on the point of view of the substance, and finally as a convinced materialist with the strongest desire for dialectic. But Ilyenkov has not yet spoken about any active understanding of the thinking of speech. Thinking and speech, sorry. For the first time, the materialistic definition of thinking as a thinking body, as a form of act of this thinking body, that marks an extremely important step in the Marxist, i.e. scientific understanding of human nature, was formulated by Ilyenkov in his article, The Question of the Identity of Thinking and Being in Pre-Marxist Philosophy, which was published in 1964. To understand thinking, one must understand the way of being a thinking body, not the structure of his body in its inactive state. This is the whole point of Spinoza's position, says Ilyenkov. It means to reveal the way it interacts with other bodies, both thinking and not thinking. In these simple words, the greatest revolutionary upheaval in philosophy, the first meaningful, not ideological appeal to the problem, the contours of which had been outlined by Marx in his famous thesis on Feuerbach. It's not surprising that this idea, striking with freshness and depth, immediately engaged many supporters and opponents, and that there have been fierce discussions around this idea for at least the last 20 years. We will not touch on the substantive details of these discussions yet. We will only note that one of the most active participants was Lev Konstantinovich Naumenko, who recently left us. According to Yelena Mareeva, fair statement, Ilyenkov's students were divided in relation to his Spinozian idea of a thinking body into two parties, which by analogy with the parties of Hegel's epigons, she designated as right Ilyenkovites and left Ilyenkovites. This name probably has a certain historical and philosophical meaning, but we would prefer to designate these parties more simply, without subtle historical and philosophical allusions, as the party forward and the party backward. The first one, which in addition to Lev Konstantinovich Naumenko included the authors of this presentation, I mean me and my friend and colleague from the years of Ilyenkov seminar, Alexander Simakin.
Sasha, you've got 2 minutes left now.
I see. I'll stop when you will say.
Are you okay? I mean, it's so more than half an hour now. So, do you want to make a final point, or should we have a little break?
Да. Сейчас хотя дочитаю страничку хотя бы. The first one, which in addition to Naumenko included the authors of the presentation, tries, relying on the ideas of Ilyenkov, to find the way to the development of Marxist thought. That is to find and try to sublate theoretical contradictions in Marxist theory. And we are convinced that it was Ilyenkov who took the first and decisive step in this direction with his profound reading of Spinoza. Second, they insist that Ilyenkov was wrong in his main theoretical conclusion, that the concept of thinking body is nothing more than a vulgar materialistic oxymoron, that Ilyenkov didn't understand and perverted Spinoza's thought, and that in fact the body is only able to extend and move in space, while thinking is an ability inherent exclusively in the disembodied soul. Do we need to say that this position actually completely negates the historical significance of Ilyenkov's work and crosses out his life as a Marxist philosopher? Here we add that the irony of history is that the main opponent of Ilyenkov's philosophy is the main publisher of his texts. However, this situation already had historical precedents. For example, after the death of Engels, the holders and the archive of Marx and Engels and the publishers of their theoretical heritage become Eduard Bernstein and Karl Kautsky, and later the Institute of Marxism-Leninism under the Stalin Central Committee of CPSU. We agree with
Thank you.
Okay.
Sasha, sorry to interrupt, but we really come to the, we need to have time for discussion, so we can always continue this at later stage. You're another presentation in the autumn, but I think we need to stop here, otherwise there won't be time for discussion. So if anybody, there's been some comments in the chat box, but I think it'd be nice if people could say it rather than just put it in the chat box.
Yeah, would you be okay to stop sharing the screen, Sasha, so that we can see each other when we're
okay.
The questions,
Okay.
I think it's in the middle and the top in the middle.
How I can stop?
I can do it. I can do it. It should be stopped. Is it stopped now?
No.
Oh, sorry, I can't do it then.
Well, it's in the middle, either at the very top or the very bottom. Bring it to the top.
So it would be at the top, stop sharing, it should say.
Yeah, so there's a green thing up at the top.
You should be able to do it, Grant.
It doesn't let me. Is it stop now? Is it okay now?
No, that's
Oh, sorry.
just sharing a different. That's sharing your screen.
Okay.
There you go.
It's Yanis is up. Cool.
Yeah. Okay. So Yanis first, and then if you have a question, then either tell us in the chat or put your hands up. Great.
Hi, Sasha. Firstly, I want to congratulate you for your speech. You mentioned active monism. What do you mean about that? Because, as I know, nowhere in Marx's work we find this concept. What do you mean? Could you explain more explicitly what you mean with this concept, active monism?
Monism as a principle is opposition to dualism. Not mention pluralism at all as a principle of ideology and religion. His main substance was nature, and all diversity of forms, of things, of
I think we've lost connectivity though. Sasha, we couldn't hear you. Oh, he's disappeared completely. Oh dear.
Well, whilst we're waiting, do you want to type in if you have any other question, and we can prepare some questions that we will ask? I'm sure there's there are interesting questions that we could direct based on the presentation and the positions that.
There you go.
Mhm.
Oh, hi Sasha, you're back now. You disappeared for a second.
And all the diversity of all things which exists in the universe, according to Spinoza, are modus of this substance. This is principle of Spinoza's materialistic monism. As argues Naumenko in his monism as a principle of dialectical logic, the consistent monism can exist only as monism materialistic, because all idealists which put in the basis of the system some idea, consciousness, etc., they feel need to save some vague form of matter in the system. Even Aristotle, who was a great materialistic tendency, finally left us dualistic system with the dead matter, which has not his form, and diversity of alive forms, active forms, entelechies. Why we name this form of monism as activity monism, деятельностный monism. Because it's impossible to build monism based on idea of contemplation, of passive contemplation. All the dead ends of philosophers who try to construct modern materialism, but put all their attempts on the false base of stimulus-reactive relations, on contemplation, passive contemplation. They couldn't overcome the idealism, basically. If we will analyze the real epistemology, not mention John Locke, the father of all consciousness of French enlightenment in methodological, so from methodological side. All they were pure idealists. For example, in this narrow circle of Ilyenkov's friends,
Nobody?
I think we've lost again. We've lost connectivity. Sasha, we lost you for a minute.
Piotr Galperin. You can see him on photo with Ilyenkov. He, in his basics of his popular handbook, Basics of Psychology, he tried to realize materialistic approach. But we can read in his text that activity, object-oriented activity, is something secondary. It is impossible without contemplation. If I can't see anything, I can't act. And this is obviously idealistic position.
Thank you, Sasha.
Have I?
Oh, sorry. Would you prefer if I share with you more than one question and then you can choose which to answer and how, or would you like one question at a time?
He's gone again. Oh no, he's back.
As soon as Sasha comes back, I'll ask again. Okay, well, it might be easier to do one. But would you prefer if I ask 3 questions now and then you choose how much you answer them, or should I do one at a time? I'll ask just one for now, if you're cutting out. So a few people have asked about this. Could you explain why was Lenin's book on imperialism a problem? So you've said that it's a problem, and then Ralph says as well that he doesn't understand the criticism of Lenin on the basis of his notion of matter causing sensation. True, this is only the rudiment of a complete elaboration of cognition, but in itself, what is the problem, and why does Spinoza solve the problem with Lenin's book? Yeah, so what's the problem with Lenin's book, and how does Spinoza help?
I can answer the first question. In imperialism as a higher stage, Lenin didn't give us the Marxist method of analysis. We have a list. He left us a list of признаков.
Signs, manifestations.
Список признаков империализма. Признаков.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, signs, signs, features, attributes.
Features of imperialism. But this is... Ой, черт, опять прервалось. Science, да.
Okay, so he only gave the features. Yeah.
Oh, you hear me. He gave us a list of signs of imperialism, monopolism, the dividing of the world between big powers, immigration, etc., etc., etc. But when I see these lists of features as a form of understanding of something, I realize that we have not any understanding. This is all only description of the surface of the phenomena. You will never find such a list in Marx's Capital. I don't even mention that this book breaks its connection with capital. The nature, the labor nature of value puts out Brasowitz, throws out,
Goes out. Yeah.
is thrown out. And Lenin began to investigate the methods of monopolistic fixation of costs. Anyway, to make a next step in development of capital, one need to continue the investigation of Marx, and not from the white paper start, and start abstractly empirical analysis.
Okay.
These political economy subjects, if you are interested, may much better than me, can comment my colleague and son, George, later.
Thank you. I'll just ask a question from Nikos, and then I'll come back to Ralph after that. I know you don't like to compare Ilyenkov to other philosophers, but within the tradition of Spinoza, there are many people who talk about post-humanism. And I know you yourself have talked about the line between what is human and not human. So I wonder if you have opinions about either what makes a human or post-humanism as an idea that we will go beyond thinking about what's human.
I see.
The dividing line.
I see. I'm not ready to discuss so-called post-humanism. Let's, for the first time, try to understand what is a human being. And according to Spinoza, according to the logic of Spinoza, not literally Spinoza himself, a human being is an active, alive animal which acts with tools.
Thank you. Okay, so Ralph, with yours, it's quite hard for me to ask the question because it's a section. So if you could ask something about the section, I'll come to you. Karina, do you want to ask your question next, and then I'll see what else we have?
Yeah,
Thank
you,
obviously,
Carol.
someone can speak rather than me reading your questions. That's fine. I'll call on you, David, after that, and then Ralph. Oh, sorry, Ralph, then David. But Karina, then Ralph, then David. Okay.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Sasha, for contributing your thoughts to our group. It's been, it's really good to be able to have your views on this. I'm a bit. I want to ask the question: Do you not agree with Ilyenkov and in his development of Spinoza, which is what the first two chapters of the Dialectical Logic are about, which is the way in which Spinoza solved the dualism, the Cartesian dualism question by seeing them as aspects of the same material, that thought and mind and matter are aspects of the same whole, substantial whole. I mean, that's what Ilyenkov took from Spinoza, and he developed that, and that was Ilyenkov's part of his tremendous contribution, and he always developed his concept of the ideal based on this, what he called cutting the Gordian knot. And I think that's the essential. It's got nothing to do with sensualism or anything else. It's seeing, starting from a holist perspective of the development of the thing itself out of itself in a dialectical, contradictory way. And that I see as the essence of Ilyenkov's contribution. And it has been developed, that contribution has been developed between the death of Marx and the rising of Ilyenkov. There has been development in Marxist thought, particularly by Engels, and then later by other people. So I don't see this big gap that you think exists. Thank you.
I'm not sure that I catch all nuances from your question. But first of all, I agree entirely with the first two chapters on dialectical logic, with Ilyenkov's interpretation of Spinoza's. In his definition that thinking is a special form of acting of a bodily subject, acting according the shape or form of its object. And I'm sure that the so-called Marxian reservation in the final fragment of the second chapter of dialectical logic, when Ilyenkov writes and that this is not enough, and we have now to enrich the Spinozian approach by some vague ideas from Marx, I think that this reservation is not correct. And the very biography, very life of Ilyenkov was fulfilled with the reflection just on this topic. And the late Ilyenkov, for example, in his article, which was published after his death, Fichte und Free Will, he claims there that he approves that animals has a conscience, that animals has a mind. Animals are not reflective automatons. And this is a serious problem, because some of Ilyenkov's disciples argued that, for example, a dog hasn't any psyche. It has reflexes. And if we can see a sleeping dog when he suddenly starts to move with his legs or even bark, and we can see that he sees dreams, so this, my colleagues answer me that this is not exact hypothesis. Maybe some insects bites this dog, and this movement has nothing to do with any images, any dreams, etc. It's only reaction on the external stimulus. This theme of mind in animals was central for Ilyenkov in his late years. And in our seminar, with great enthusiasm, he tells us stories. By the way, now we can find a lot of such stories in YouTube, where crows, monkeys demonstrate their intellect and not reflexes, conditioned or inborn. And this means that the idea of Ilyenkov developed, and developed in definite direction.
Thanks. So, Ralph, if you want to speak, and then a question from David after that.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, there's several passages, mostly in the chapter 2, that are a little tangled and confusing to me. This particular one that I put in the group chat seems to be a very almost incomprehensible way of saying something that I think is simple, at least best I understand it. What distinguishes materialism, sensible and dialectical, from mechanistic materialism that knows and recognizes only one variety of necessity, described in language of mechanistically interpreted physics and mathematics. All right, what that says to me is that the difference between dialectical and mechanistic materialism is that mechanistic materialism is based on physics and doesn't have the ability to grapple with conscious beings, with the nature of consciousness and thought. Okay, that's what that means to me. And then the next sentence, only nature as a whole, understood as an infinite whole in space and time, whatever that means, generating its own partial forms of itself, which I suppose is different kinds of entities, possesses at any moment of time, though not at any point in space, all the wealth of its attributes. That is, those properties that are reproduced in its makeup of necessity and not by chance. Now, I almost don't even understand that, but what it seems to me is that it's basically saying that natural laws encompass all the different properties that exist in all of the entities in the universe. But I don't know what it means to say that only nature as a whole possesses at any point of time all the wealth of its attributes. Does that mean that the whole universe has consciousness? It's a very confused passage, and it seems to make something extremely complicated out of what just seems to be showing the difference between a viewpoint that just relegates itself to, physical properties on the lowest level and the properties of conscious beings. The rest of this seems to be very messy to me. I mean, what is being said that I'm missing?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure that I catch.
So within that, one question was, why is it nature as a whole that's needed? Does Ilyenkov mean that all of nature contains intelligence or is intelligence?
I see.
And how is that related to these ideas about
I see.
mechanistic materialism versus a dialectical approach?
I see that the idea of superhuman mind, something universal, mind of universe, is nothing but metaphor. Marx, in the beginning of German ideology, put forward very simple words. Our departing point are individuals, alive individuals, with their needs and with their hands. So I'm not sure that this abstraction of universal mind of the universe is something substantial. From the other side, individual if we mean animal individual, its ability to act, its ability to object-oriented activity is limited by its organic body. Snake, for example, can't fly, or elephants can't make caves because they have not sufficient organic tools. From the other side, a human builds artificially his organs. He builds the whole system of such inorganic tools. And that's why the activity of a human being can be universal. If we need to swim, we put on our feet fish tails. If we want to fly, we construct airplane, etc. But if animals also use artificial tools, but animals can construct such tools only here and now, according to their actual need. While a human being makes the production of tools his main task. So the tools, or the human tools, has a great history. That's why we can't master a new tool without another person who knows how this tool can work. Even in case with soap, in Ilyenkov's example, which he likes, when we feed a baby with a spoon, putting the spoon in the hand of baby and taking the hand of baby in our own. Without elder teacher, the spoon will remain just a stick, just something metallic or wooden. That's why the human history is not zoological history, because what are we depends much more to what tools we have than to our natural qualities. An old man, and very old man, if he had great money, will be attractive for young girl. And this money will be that signs of his social status and possibilities. So the class struggle can be understood as the struggle for fair распределение.
Distribution.
Distribution, thank you. Distribution of this human means of production of our own life.
Okay, thank you. So David and then Andrew, and then that'll probably be it. David, you're muted at the moment.
Yeah, just thank you. Yes, yeah, I really would like to say that I appreciate the spirit of the presentation, in that I totally agree that Marxism, whatever it is, cannot be understood as some kind of gospel, and that the only way to understand it is critically. And we know more and more about this because it's, you know, from recent studies and as the more and more of Marxist papers are published, it's clear that Capital was fundamentally incomplete. And so I agree with but this applies to everyone. It applies to Marx, it applies to Engels, Lenin, Ilyenkov. So I totally agree with you about that. My disagreements with you start with the application of that idea. And I think that you made a series of judgments. Well, there are particular, which I find just far too sweeping. So, but there are particular details. For example, you say that in the dialectics of the abstract and the concrete, if I understood you rightly, Ilyenkov hadn't got beyond some kind of simple sensualism. And I really just don't think that's true. And I posted a quote up, but shall I read it, Kirill?
Yeah.
Actual assimilation of some area of culture or other, some form of human activity or other, means assimilating it to such an extent as to be able to develop it further in an independent, individual and creative way. Nothing can be assimilated through passive contemplation. That is like building castles in the air. Assimilation without active practice yields no results. And I think that it's not the main thing that he wants to develop in that book, but I think that he is a long way beyond sensualism. It is clear from that and other texts in the book. So that's one point, but if I can, I'd like to make a few others. I think that the idea that Marxism basically stopped being operational with, or creative with Engels, is just not sustainable. You know, there have been so many Marxists, and, you know, I don't know if you're thinking specifically of philosophy, but even in a little old backwater of Marxism like the United Kingdom, I can say that over that period, you know, we've had many significant contributions to Marxism from historians, possibly from economists, but, you know, there's a lot of stuff going on. And I know from my reading of French Marxism as well, that you know, there's a massive stuff. And I would say even actually in the Soviet Union, you know, not only was there Ilyenkov, but there were people like Mark Rosenthal, there were scientists like Vladimir Fock, in general relativity, and a guy in quantum mechanics whose name escapes me at the moment, but a lot of people giving serious Marxist thought to various problems. So I'm a bit disturbed by sweeping the whole of the 20th century aside in that way. And I would say, for example, in France, you had very rich discussion in the through the 60s with people like Louis Althusser, who established useful things. And I'm not an Althusserian, but, you know, he managed to deal with the idea that the true Marx, you know, was the Marx of 1843. And, you know, there was serious discussion about that. Yeah, on the, I didn't quite see where it fitted in, but on the question of the animals and animal consciousness and so on, you know, we have Soviet authors who were writing about this, like Leontiev, material from the 30s and 40s in his what's the book called? I can't remember. Development of Mind or something like that, where he develops his theory of the development of psyche from the very earliest cell form of the psyche through various stages, and all of which involve some differing forms of activity. So, you know, I just think that it's just too much to sweep these people aside. And I would just back up, last point, I would back up the idea that when authors say that, as Lenin does in Materialism and Imperial Criticism, that sensualism, either say or imply, sensualism is a prerequisite. That a prerequisite is not a theory. That's not the whole story. So, you know, Lenin says that matter is that which exists independently of our consciousness and which is known to us through our sensations. That's not the end of the story. It's a prerequisite, not a theory. So I think you've been rather unfair about a number of authors.
Okay, so it's up to you, Sasha, if you want to respond to any specific thing. You don't have to respond to everything. There's only if you have a comment.
Oh, I'm glad that we meet today, and that we start our conversation, because there is a lot of prejudice in interpretation Marx. There is so-called Western Marxism, Marxism of Sartre, Marxism of Althusser, Marxism of Frankfurt School, etc., etc., etc. Don't mention Marxism of Chairman Mao. Ilyenkov and we, his disciples, are sure that Marxism can be one and only one. And to reach this Marxism, we can only if we are collectively will reflect on these subjects and collectively try to clear some difficult problems, because problems are a lot before us, theoretical problems. I think that the historical moment in which we are now living demands from us left theorists to put forward something more articulated than vague left ideas. And to do it, we have to reread Marx and reread him, as well as Ilyenkov's text, critically, aiming to develop them, because it's only one form which allows us to develop something, find contradiction, and find the way to sublate this contradiction.
Thank you. We don't have long left, so we'll come to Andrew, and then if you're able to answer, to give a short answer, then we'll see if we have time with Yanis, and then it's back to Karina, and we'll finish. So Andrew next.
So, thank you very much for the presentation. My question is, do you agree with Ilyenkov that at the end of chapter 2 of Dialectical Logic, where he says that in fact thought is an attribute of social labour, Marx's concept of social labour, and rather than, or as a development of the Spinozist concept of thought being a attribute of substance? That's my question.
I think that the definition of thinking as form of acting of bodily subject is the exact definition, Marxist, exact materialistic definition of thinking. We don't need to add to this definition some vague ideas about society. I have enough time today, because the frame of my speech was very short, to tell us that this prejudice that the labor is something fantastic, which can transform the mechanical automaton, which was animal, to thinking human subject, is a nonsense. The only thing which can be added to this materialistic understanding of thinking is arbitrary sign. But all arbitrariness was the very thing against which Ilyenkov tried to fight. For example, in the first chapter of dialectical logic, he mentioned Locke with his semiotics. And he mentioned every time when Ilyenkov mentions Locke, he did it with disgust, because he feel Locke as his main opponent. And if we will take, for example, two such figures as Vygotsky and Leontiev in Soviet psychology. Leontiev was very close to Ilyenkov, and his idea of предметная деятельность, object-oriented activity, was in fact Spinozian idea. While Vygotsky put forward the idea that first of all, we are born as mechanical automatons, but later we invent science, and we use this science to liberate ourselves. The idea of triangle of Vygotsky means just this idea. In the basics of this triangle, we have stimulus-reaction relation. We have relation which has nothing to do with any freedom. This is mechanical determinism. And how to override this determinism, how to free ourselves. And Vygotsky's answer is something not very profound. He says, we invent sign, or somebody others invent sign, and with aid of this sign, we change our behavior and react not to this stimulus, but some another stimulus. And such we became free. This is nonsense. Automaton has not such an organ to invent idea that it is unfree. So it doesn't need to liberate himself. Only is in science fiction, robots organize riots to become free. Real iron or washing machine doesn't need any freedom. It's just stimulus reactive automaton. But the idea that any science which can arbitrarily assign to some things that this can liberate us is absolutely false. Soviet authorities changed the labels on the fabrics and plants from the private property to people's property. And what? And nothing changed. The workers remain the wage workers. This system remains capitalist system. So the problem is not in science. Problem is in real object-oriented activity with tools. And the relations which arises in context of such activity.
Thanks. I think Karina, it's your call. I'm guessing we don't have time for Yanis's question, or should we end with Yanis?
Do you want to put your question quickly, Yanis? He says no.
If you want to ask it, we do have 5 minutes, Yanis.
Okay, very fast. Okay, dear Sasa, from your whole presentation and from the discussion after that, I can't see where is Hegel. For example, you gave me the impression that Marxism is the direct result from the Spinozian philosophy, and but in reality, Marxism is the result of Hegelian philosophy. The direct origin of Marxism is Hegelianism. It's not the Spinozian philosophy. So I would like to hear your opinion about Spinozian and Hegelian philosophy, and what there are differences in their impact on Marxism. But we don't have time anymore. So that was my question. Because you gave me the impression that you approach Marxism mostly as a result of Spinozian philosophy, and not as a result of Hegelian philosophy.
We probably don't have much time, but just, is there anything you take from Hegel? Very briefly.
Repeat, please, in short, this question. I don't catch it.
Well, is there anything that you take from Hegel? So your philosophy is very much about Spinoza.
Oh,
is there anywhere where you think that actually Hegel is important?
Oh. I think that Hegel, as well as many others big philosophers, are not super Marxists. And we can't take one from one, another from another, one thing. I think that Hegel was sublated by Marx, and what was substantive in his philosophy just contains in Marx's approach. In more detailed my text, when I try to explain the difference between mechanical movement and a live movement. Mechanical movement, for example, a movement of water pouring from the mountain. It's not a live movement, though it acts according to the shape of the mountain. But the real alive movement has a dialectical character. It is movement according to the shape of its object and across the shape of its object. I'm afraid now we have too little time to explain such
Thank you, yeah.
complicated details, but this is just dialectics.
But perhaps on our Facebook, if there's something more you want to say, then we can post questions and answer them on the Facebook page.
Okay, I will be happy to answer.
Great, thank you. Back to Karina. Thank you very much.
We could post a presentation as well somewhere.
Yes, Sasha, we could post the presentation on Facebook, and
yes,
and
of course. I'll finish my presentation and we'll post.
Okay, we can put it on the record of the meeting as well.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasha. Just really one final point, which kind of, I think it takes up something that Ralph was saying earlier in the chat box. When I think Ralph raised the question about the passage about nature as a whole. I think he read out that one of the quotes from, asking what was meant by that. And I think that's really important. With the section where Ilyenkov writes about, is it nature as a whole we're talking about, and how does the ideal or the reflection of nature in human thought, how does that relate to this whole? What is the connection between these two, which is the whole subject of this?
I see.
This essay. So I just want to say that I actually think this is probably the important thing we should take from this first part of dialectical logic, because it relates to our whole discussion, which is that Ilyenkov stresses that because of the nature of human thought, it is able to grasp things in motion, that the object of thought is constantly in motion, and we reflect that in concepts, in mental concepts, but they're not, these things are not the same. These things are dialectically self-related opposites.
Yep.
And that is what Ilyenkov stresses, is we have this capacity to grasp things because nature itself is infinite, and we have an infinite capacity, potential to grasp it. And that's the source of movement in thought. I'm just going to finish, Sasha. This question of plasticity, the plasticity of human thought, is an incredibly pioneering development by Ilyenkov, to have written about this before even the understanding of the plasticity of learning in the human mind has been grasped in science. So I don't think Ilyenkov was wrong about any of these things. Actually, I think he was right, and that he develops the concept of the ideal in that spirit. So it's not David. It's not meaningless. It just has to be. It's probably not a great translation, and also it needs to be developed and thought about. I don't think it's meaningless to say that nature is infinite and that we are constantly struggling to grapple with the constant changes, contradictory changes in nature and in human society and in thought. We do that continuously, and that's quite inspirational, that thought. Okay, thank you. Sorry, didn't want to go on. Kirill, are we going to finish up here, aren't we?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, well, thank you everybody, and as I said, please do send your thoughts and ideas, not just on Facebook, but hopefully by email as well, because we can certainly discuss it all. And we will, as I said, we will be sending out a little survey to gather your ideas about these webinars and how we can develop them, and have future events, and also a symposium in the new year. We're looking at May, June, hopefully, depending on the virus, which we have no control over. Ralph is raising his eyebrows. Okay, well, with that, I think, thank you very much. Thank you, Sasha, and thank you everybody for taking part.